Hello and welcome to my channel NB Soundcopy UK, and the subject of this video will be 2025 minus 50, my favourite 10 albums from 1975. 1975 was not a particularly great year for music in my opinion. Any residual energy left from the late 1960s and early 1970s had disappeared, and the UK singles chart was mostly dominated by lifeless, middle of the road songs or anaesthetising comic trash, such as Whispering Grass by Donna Estelle and Windsor Davis, Stand By Your Man by Tammy Wynette, I Only Have Eyes for You by Art Garfunkel, and Barbados by Typically Tropical. The album's chart was equally dull, with the top four sellers being The Best of the Stylistics, Once Upon a Star by the Bay City Rollers, Atlantic Crossing by Rod Stewart, and The Best of Jim Reeves. Despite all this, I've managed to find 10 albums released in 1975 which I have and really like. 10th is Indiscreet by Sparks. This was the last album recorded by Sparks while still based in England. Even though it's not as guitar-based as previous albums, these songs retain a significant dollop of the quirkiness that makes Sparks a fun band to listen to. Big band jazz, a string quartet, a marching band, various other styles pushing the boundaries of pop, and a little of the guitar sound of its day, it's all included. Looks, Tits, It Ain't 1918, Pineapple, and Hospitality on Parade all highlight the humour and clever arrangements. Was it a surprise that the album didn't really catch on? In the post-glam rock malaise and lack of adventure that typified 1975? Maybe not. Music in the UK in 1975 may have been in decline, but Sparks weren't. Indiscreet is well worth a listen. 9th is Fawcett by UFO. I wouldn't describe this as my favourite UFO album, but it's one of their steadiest and most consistent. Sometimes those qualities, along with good track sequencing, are all I need from an album. In terms of the band's discography, this was the second album featuring Michael Schenker on lead guitar. Whilst there's nothing as spectacular as Rock Bottom from Phenomenon, Let It Roll, Shoot Shoot, Out in the Streets, Mother Mary, and Too Much of Nothing are all creditable, no-frills rock tracks. Final track, This Kids, including Between the Walls, is the most sophisticated composition, and it concludes what is arguably a safe and low-risk album. Nevertheless, there are much worse ways to spend 38 minutes than to listen to an album which, thanks to the track sequence, helps make it greater than the sum of its parts. 8. Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd. As an ashen-faced reflection on what happened to Syd Barrett and an illustration of Roger Waters' growing distaste for the music business, this is a fine album. To be frank though, if it weren't for Shine On You Crazy Diamond, it probably wouldn't have made my favourite 10. That track, divided into two sections bookending the album, is one of the real high points of Pink Floyd's career. Brilliantly arranged and played, it stands head and shoulders above everything else on the album. That's not to say I dislike the rest of it. Although the lyric is pretty dreadful, Welcome to the Machine is an ambitious track. Have a Cigar, sung by Roy Harper, is also decent. Lyrically, it goes into the type of territory that would be explored further on The Wall a few years later. The melancholy title track also has its merits, although I think some of the praise it gets is a little overblown. I suppose I am nitpicking a little regarding those tracks. It's just that Shine On You Crazy Diamond dominates the album in a good way. 7. The original soundtrack by 10cc. My memory could be playing tricks on me, but I think this is the first album I ever bought. The year after it came out, I started a paper round, so affording albums suddenly became more realistic. Anyway, with two hits to its name by the time I bought it, Life is a Minestrone and I'm Not in Love, and 10cc being a band whose earlier singles I also liked, the original soundtrack was precisely the sort of thing I enjoyed at the time, and it remains a rewarding listen for me. Nuit et Paris seemed like a dauntingly long track at first, but gradually grew on me, even if some of the humour was a touch too subtle for me to get as a 13-year-old. The multi-layered vocals on I'm Not in Love, a number one single in the UK, were innovative in 1975 and still sound great now. Blackmail and the second sitting for The Last Supper provide a rockier edge, whereas Life is a Minestrone, Brand New Day, Flying Junk, and The Film of My Love showed different aspects of what the band were capable of. Too clever by half, maybe? I don't care. I liked it then and continue to do so. 6. Caress of Steel by Rush. Caress of Steel isn't too highly thought of by many fans of Rush, so the fact that I've chosen it might seem a little strange, all the more so since the album Fly By Night was also released in 1975. However, I think of Rush as the band that had plenty of great tracks, but few great albums. On most, there's a fair amount of unevenness, resulting in a mix of excellent and not so excellent tracks. Caress of Steel may not be Rush's most extravagant offering, but the tracks all sit well together. Bastille Day probably stands out for many people, but I think I'm Going Bald is a solid track. Lakeside Park provides a pleasant change of pace, and The Necromancer as a postscript to Bite or on the Snow Dog from Fly By Night is a well-worked three-part conclusion to side one. The undulating multi-part track, The Fountain of Lamneth, takes up the whole of side two, a tale highlighting how the journey can be better than the destination. A nicely paced and balanced album. 5th is Young Americans by David Bowie. When Diamond Dogs was released in 1974, you probably would have got long odds on betting that a year later, David Bowie's next album would largely contain soul music, a radical change of tack. An album which divided opinion in 1975, it seems to be more kindly thought of nowadays. Rightly so, I'd say, because there's some great stuff on Young Americans. His move to America saw Bowie put together a new backing band, and meeting up with fellow expat John Lennon led to the co-written track Fame, along with guitarist Carlos Alomar, as well as a cover of the Beatles' Across the Universe. Among the backing singers on the album is one Luther Vandross, another to have a co-writer credit, this time for the track Fascination. That track uses call and response vocals and is used well, but an even better example is on the track Somebody Up There Likes Me, where the layered vocals slightly evoke Lou Reed's Satellite of Love. With Young Americans, what you get are 8 mostly soul tracks, but with an edgy feel that gives the album a distinct sound. 4th, Warrior on the Edge of Time by Hawkwind. The main inspiration for this album was the Eternal Champion series of books by Michael Moorcock, a collaborator with Hawkwind before and after this album. Therefore, unlike Choose Your Masks, which I panned in my 6 Loads of Old Pony video, partly due to the unconnected nature of the sci-fi lyrics, Warrior on the Edge of Time is more coherent and has a sense of purpose. Furthermore, its variety makes it one of my favourites of theirs. The album starts in fine fashion with Assault and Battery, which segues, courtesy of a piercing synth part, into the Golden Void. Then comes The Wizard Blew His Horn, the first of 3 spoken word poems on the album, written by Moorcock and backed by atmospheric keyboards and excellent percussion. The motoric rhythm on Opal Ochre owes a lot to krautrock, especially Noi and Can. I could go on to gush about all the remaining tracks, but I'll resist the temptation other than to say that after his debut on Hall of the Mountain Grill in 1974, the contribution of Simon House on keyboards and violin greatly enhanced Hawkwind's range on Warrior on the Edge of Time, a thoroughly enjoyable album. 3. Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin. On my 6 Loads of Old Pony video, I also stuck the boot in on Led Zeppelin's album Houses of the Holy. Physical Graffiti, its follow-up, is by contrast what I believe to be their finest and quite a feat for a double studio album. Curiously, part of this album was recorded at the same time as Houses of the Holy, so maybe there was a hidden plan in operation. Release the dross on Houses of the Holy and bounce back with a 15-track masterpiece. It's quite an eclectic mix when you compare tracks like Kashmir, Bronya Ore, Down by the Seaside, Trampled Underfoot, 10 Years Gone and Custard Pie. If I had to pick a standout track, which is difficult because each have their strengths. It would be In My Time of Dying. The drum arrangement on this is absolutely superb, and for me, a real high point of rock drumming, with the parts played by the rest of the band also being right up there. Overall, this is as good as it gets with Led Zeppelin. 2. Sabotage by Black Sabbath. I had plenty to say about Sabotage on my Black Sabbath album ranking video a few months back. I don't mind repeating myself, though, by saying that I consider it to be their best album, among my favourite heavy rock stroke metal, call it what you will, albums of the 1970s. Hole in the Sky, Don't Start Too Late, Symptom of the Universe, Megalomania, Thrill of It All, Superstar, Am I Going Insane Radio are all great tracks. Album closer, The Writ, is a bit overcomplicated, but it's still not far behind the rest. If you could only have one album by Black Sabbath and wanted a recommendation, then Sabotage is the one to get. Number 1, Noi 75 by Noi. This album tends to go in and out of my favourite 10 ever. There are very few albums whose influence can be heard in as wide a range of genres as post-punk, punk, ambient, goth, shoegaze and post-rock. Issy, the opening track, is probably the most straightforward insofar as it has a krautrock sound building on what they'd recorded on their first 2 albums. Then comes Sealand with a kind of bass line that can be found all over post-punk and goth 5 or 6 years later, and to a lesser extent in shoegaze a further 10 years on. Third track, Lev Vol, sees things getting more ambient and post-rock before that term even existed. Side 2 starts with Hero, a track that David Bowie paid homage to via his song Heroes, and you definitely hear the guitar line being referenced later by Susie and the Banshees on Hong Kong Garden. The drum rhythm on eMusic is one that would reappear on the Joy Division track Transmission, as well as numerous other post-punk and goth tracks in the early 80s. Final track, After 8, has a full-on punk sound and is a great way to finish what I feel is a remarkable album, both in its own right and for its considerable influence on others. In truth, I didn't have to think too hard to select these albums, as I don't believe there's an awful lot of competition amongst what I own from 1975. A Night at the Opera by Queen, Another Green World by Brian Eno, Fly By Night by Rush, and Radioactivity by Kraftwerk, perhaps. That's about it, though. In the description for this video, there are links for one track from each of the albums I've spoken about. If you liked this video, then please leave a comment and or subscribe. If you think it's crap, please leave a comment and get it off your chest by having a rant. But for now, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching.